This is going to be quite a detailed video from start to finish, with a lot of points leading into the following topics of the video. So for the sake of better understanding what will be discussed as the video continues towards its conclusion, I suggest you watch it in its entirety. However, for those that want to skip to parts that interest them the most, there are timestamps down in the description for you to be able to use as you see fit. This was not an easy video to do, as I had started and stopped this video several different times, most of the time with the idea that it hopefully wouldn't be so relevant so quickly going into the future. But the more I see these conversations coming up, and especially with the wrong ideas being discussed while crucial information is overlooked or disregarded, I wanted to chime in with my thoughts. Going forward into this video, I do expect you to understand what I'm going to present and why. This video is to discuss some key issues for the idea of equal and fair practices in sports, as well as understanding the issues involving bathrooms along the genders of men, women, and transgenders. For each of the topics, I'll be trying to play to both sides of the discussion as best I can, as I personally believe that to better understand what is being addressed, it is necessary to talk from both sides of the coin. Even if one may not like what the opposing side says, thinks, feels, or does, to get a better rounded understanding means to understand each and every side coming to the table to discuss what's being talked about. This video is not made to be able to come to definitive conclusions as to what to do better in any situation mentioned. However, I will offer insight where it is needed to explain my reasonings. I wanted to make this video to get a better grasp on these issues and to drive for a more healthy and realistic conversation on what is right versus what is fair, and how and if they can meet in the middle, whether it be in the present or the foreseeable future. With that said, we're going to ease into the conversation with focusing first on the more original discussion of the idea of fairness and equality between men and women in sports. Number 1. Tennis. When it comes to the similarities for the sport, the size of the court and ball are the same between men and women, and in normal competitions, both sexes play best of 3 sets. As far as the top competitions in tennis, including the Grand Slam tournaments, the prize money is the same for both men and women. However, when it comes to the sets played, men have to play the best 3 out of 5, while the women play the best 2 out of 3. The reasoning for these rules is stated because different organizations oversee the men's side than the one that oversees the women's side, meaning that each side gets to establish their own rules. Regardless of any organization overseeing either men or women, the conversation will eventually surface, whether publicly or privately, on which players are better, not only comparing players within the same sex, but comparing men and women. In 1998, Serena Williams claimed that she could take on any man outside of the 200th rank. German tennis player Karsten Brosch, who was ranked 203rd in the world, stepped up to play Serena and her sister Venus, and after first beating Serena 6-1, he then beat Venus 6-2. Brosch then stated that he actually played at less than the best that he was capable of to be able to keep it fun. Since that match, Serena went on to adjust the number and claimed that she could take on anyone outside of the rank of 350. John McEnroe faced backlash after making a statement about Serena, explaining in a different interview that if he had to give Serena a number she would fit in for the best tennis player, that the number he gave was taken as less than respectful by peers.
I've respect Serena very much so, okay? And I was simply calling her on an NPR, which supposedly you're supposed to, this is where you can say it like it is and you're going to get honest feedback. She's the greatest player, the female player that ever lived. Then the lady said to me, I don't remember which one, but she said, why did you say woman? Why didn't you just say the greatest, tennis player that ever lived? And so then I felt the need, however, unfortunately, I'm probably to defend myself. I don't know, just say what I really felt. Which is about what I think she would be. I think you're referring to the fact that I said she'd be about 700 in the world.
Yeah.
I've got a solution, Gail, though, because I know that you're friendly with Serena, and I think I, at least until yesterday, I was
right now. I'm just waiting. Would you like to apologize?
No.
Serena herself has gone on to state that men and women's tennis are very different.
Men's tennis and women's tennis are completely almost 2 separate sports. So, if I were to play Andy Murray, I would lose 6-0, 6-0 in 5 to 6 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, because it's true. It's true. It's a completely different sport. The men are a lot faster, and they serve harder, they hit harder. It's just a different game, and I love to play women's tennis, and I only want to play girls because I don't want to be embarrassed. I would not do the tour. I wouldn't do Billie Jean any justice. So Andy, stop it.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna let you kill me.
Number 2, basketball. As far as basketball, this is the sport that seems to get the most criticism between the sexes. Some of the on-court differences between the two are WNBA has closer 3-point line, a smaller basketball, and their quarters are shortened to 10 minutes compared to the NBA's 15-minute quarters. However, the main issue that comes up between the two are that the WNBA players don't make the millions that their male counterparts make. many WNBA players going on to say that they are just as good, if not better than men. Even in an interview with Candace Parker, the woman interviewing her makes the claim that the WNBA players need to be respected and paid accordingly, as their games are just as good as the NBA's.
Short, I'm saying pay these women. That's what I'm saying. She's gonna go elegant about it. You need to be paid because you command the same respect. The game is just as good. People have to go and watch it.
The idea of the pay gap comes from the concept of being paid out accordingly to what is being able to be drawn in for each league. For example, the reason the NBA players get the multi-million-dollar contracts is because the revenue the NBA makes is in the billions of dollars, while the reason the WNBA players make significantly less is because their league brings in less money than it costs to run it, including paying out all of the players and all of the maintenance, marketing of the game, and part of the marketing is providing entertainment to new fans, that of which Tracy McGrady admits needs some work.
The skill level is off the charts in women's basketball, right? But I think as far as bringing the entertainment,
Yeah, I understand that.
that element, I think, you gain more fair.
Marketing plays such a critical role in getting engagement towards whatever one may be selling to the audience, and in this case, the WNBA trying to bring in more people into the seats to help generate more revenue. Part of the marketing is having a very eye-catching highlight reel to showcase the talent either of the night between the teams playing or an overall reel of the talent within the WNBA. Audiences want to be drawn into action, to excitement, and for basketball, I do have to agree that when I watched basketball, aside from seeing amazing fadeaway threes, seeing dunks, especially aggressive ones between rivals, was quite the draw-in to hope for seeing it in the upcoming game. One of the concepts that many of these WNBA players talking money versus the NBA either do not know or do not want to acknowledge that since the start of the WNBA, the NBA has been supplementing the losses that the WNBA has every year. Without that money, the WNBA wouldn't be able to continue. And now that an agreement in increasing salaries has been made for the WNBA, meaning more money will be spent, if the amount of money being brought in doesn't increase, the future of the WNBA will be at risk. As far as talking about possible solutions to bring in more money for their league, some of the WNBA players are disgusted at the idea of making the hoop shorter, as the draw-in shouldn't be if they could dunk or not.
What can we do to get those fans to tune in? And I was like, why can't we lower the goal to at least 9.5 feet? Because I think for somebody that don't watch WNBA basketball, to have women dunking on other women would definitely bring more excitement to that game and have, those guys that don't watch WNBA basketball tune in and you get more fans that way. What do you think about that?
I mean, my thought on it is, I've been playing basketball on a 10-foot hoop my whole life. So to move it to 9.5, it's going to take a long time to get used to that. And then also, we're only playing basketball to dunk? I'm not sure.
No, you playing...
you just want to see me dunk on somebody?
Although one player has said herself that lowering the rim would be a good start. A lot of people watch games in person because of the action they get to witness, and one of the things that is enjoyed is dunking. Even at one point, shattering the backboard was sought after as a highlight of achievement. Shaq admitting he did it on purpose to gain attention, as it was all but a guarantee in the top plays and could help him with endorsements. With less action overall, some fans noticed it would be less entertaining, such as how a Twitter user said to Kobe how dunking was once an expectation, now is something to actually highlight. RIP to the Black Mamba.
Remember when Kobe Bryant used to dunk and it wasn't a surprise? And every time he dunks, it's a big deal. I remember that.
To this day, there is no rule stating that women can't play in the NBA, as it is not specific for men to only partake in, and technically one woman has been drafted so far, but never actually played a game in the NBA. Many of these WNBA players talking money leads a lot of people to question why more of the WNBA players are not trying out to be in the NBA. Number 3. Skateboarding. Women's skateboarding started to become more recognized in the last decade. There always were standout individuals that people knew of, but now women's skateboarding is far more recognized and respected as women are progressing rather quickly. When it comes to comparing men and women's progressions in skateboarding, this is where I feel women aren't behind compared to men, but rather the widespread of women's skateboarding didn't start when men's did. Therefore, the progression for the women's side isn't in the same place as the men's is currently, respectfully speaking. I compare from when women's skateboarding started growing to the present day as when Rowley explained in his classic covers, his frontside board slide on Hollywood 16 was insane back when it was the cover of Thrasher in February 1999. And now kids these days don't even warm up with that trick, as they often warm up with harder tricks. Women's skateboarding is at that same point symbolically, where Rowley frontboarded Hollywood 16, and you have to give them time to continue progressing no matter what direction or directions they take it in. You can't expect them to just be at the level playing field with guys in the present day. Even Fabiana Delfino recently dropped a Spitfire part, and her tail slide ender she did, I did almost 10 years ago and wasn't mad to see it. Just bummed that the spot wasn't that cleaned up when I did it because I had a harder trick in mind to do, but wouldn't even consider trying it without a clear landing since I was going to be rolling into the bank switch, or backwards for those that don't know skateboarding. When it comes to the scoring for contests, let's take SLS or street league skateboarding for example. The men's and women's side are scored differently, as the level of difficulty between the two aren't the same. Take for example the lip slide Leticia did on the flat bar to drop. It was scored a 9.0, and the board slide following it was scored at 8.5. But when looking at the men's side of the same exact contest, a 360 flip nose slide heel flip out was given a 9.2, and on the same flat bar to drop, Nija's 360 flip to lip slide was scored at a 9.6, meaning that even adding in a difficult flip trick into the same trick Leticia did on the same obstacle, Nija's score was only increased by 0.6 for his effort. When Leticia Buffoni was interviewed on the 9 Club recently, Chris Roberts asked her about the scores when it came to the Olympics, as the women's scores were based on the same scale as the men's. To which she replied that men and women should be judged differently.
The men scored a certain way and the women's was scored a different scale? Is that what you're saying? You would prefer that?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah?
Live off men's skating, it's way bigger than the women's, but they should definitely change the scoring.
Chris showed his disinterest in the idea of scoring the women on the same level as the men for a variety of reasons. Speaking from the standpoint of a fan, knowing how hard some of the women worked to push themselves to their fullest potential, and seeing the low-level scores given not only brought less excitement as a fan, but it could affect the women in judging what tricks to follow up with for the scores that they already received. Now that we have gone through some key points for a few different sports, this then begs the question of which idea is right, being treated equally or treating the sexes differently, because there are important ideas to consider for both sides, that if we treat them equally, then there shouldn't be a need for a separation of men and women, that everyone competes against one another and the top athletes, regardless of gender, are going to win and the high prize money is up for grabs equally, making this on paper fair for everyone. But also if you treat them differently, it would mean the acknowledgement that men and women are different, and there are advantages and disadvantages to both sexes depending on the situation they are placed in. If the women are scored against the men's scores, that is more equal, meaning that if Nija or Yuto does a frontside crook on a rail and gets a 4, then any of the women doing the same trick on the same obstacle should get the same score. That way the scoring is based on the tricks themselves, regardless of the sex of the person that does them.
Example, like Momoji, she scored 15.26 to win the gold in women's, right? 8th place was Gustavo Ribeiro, Portugal. He got a 15.05. You know what I'm saying? So the 8th place men, 15 was a first place gold, 15.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I think that they deserve to be able to get the 8s, the 9s. Yeah, they should be judged on the level of their skating, obviously, but like based on the points system, like just ride with the same point system that you do with the guys. But adjusted, right? Yeah, exactly.
And it's clearly based on what we assume the top of a skateboarder is able to produce, right? So
Sure.
If you're already going to make that assumption about the guys, you can make a separate assumption about the girls based on what we've seen before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you kind of know what the guys are capable of, and also the women too, right?
Yeah.
You can kind of make that judgment. I mean, but not when one of the girls is doing front crooks. Like I'm like, bro, that's like dudes are doing shit. Imagine doing that and you get a 4. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like if it was like, you know, Nija doing front crooks versus the girl doing front crooks, I think they should be judged the same. That's just, I don't know, they're doing the same trick.
Or if you have the women's scores adjusted to give them a higher score, this would be seen as more fair to the women, but understand the bias that it'll create whether you want to recognize it or not, as the more basic tricks will be scored better and more on par with the difficult tricks that the men do. However, do understand that the idea of what is fair overall is very subjective.
For now, that's where it's at, and then I think down the line, I think it will equal out, and then it's like it'll be one big scale. Correct?
We'll see where it goes.
But with the women's tennis, as I mentioned earlier, the women in Grand Slam tournaments get the same prize money and play less sets. They do less work and get equal outcome for winners. To some, if not considering the strengths and weaknesses of each sex's bodies within their anatomy, wouldn't consider that equality, as being treated exactly as an equal in all regards is what the feminist movement has been all about. When some of the female athletes have been asked if they would entertain the idea of combining men and women in sports, as John McEnroe suggested to combat the backlash he got for his comments regarding Serena Williams.
Why don't you combine, just solve the problem? I'm sure the men would be all for this. The men and women play together, and then we don't have to guess.
They confidently said that they don't want to compete against men.
Even if they're on the same scale, would you want to have guys and girls competing against each other on that level, or does it matter?
I don't think you should be competing against
That's why I was like, I don't know if it matters. I think men and women would probably want to compete guess so.
Just keep us separate.
For me, tennis and men's tennis and women's tennis are completely almost two separate sports. I love to play women's tennis, and I only want to play girls because I don't want to be embarrassed.
Number 4, transgender inclusion in sports. This has become a huge topic of discussion, especially as of lately, mostly over what is equal and fair between cis women and trans women. Before we continue, I want to give some understandings of the genders to not confuse anybody. To be cis means you identify as the sex you were assigned at birth, and what you were assigned at birth is called your natal sex, meaning if you were born biologically a male, for example, your natal sex is male, and if you identify with being a male in that scenario, you are a cis male. A transgender means you do not identify as your natal sex. However, that doesn't limit you to identifying as simply a man or a woman. Other identities may also include gender fluid and non-binary, just to add a few. However, it goes much deeper than that, but that's not the focus of this point. The main debate stems from the idea of trans women having an advantage over cis women when it comes to sports, even with the idea of trans women going through hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. It has been argued that being on HRT for at least a year should help with the level of playing field between trans women and cis women, as many places that include trans women to compete against cis women state in their rules that as a trans woman, the testosterone levels need to be within a specific level for them to be able to compete. Samantha Lux talked about this in one of her prior videos, stating that the studies have been done on several trans athletes to show that the difference in their strength, endurance, and overall performance comparing to pre and post transition within the year needed to be on HRT would be that of a cis woman competitor.
In most sports, the disadvantages that trans women experience after going on HRT balance out the advantages that they experience to a point where a fair competition is totally possible. Joanna Harper, who is a medical physicist and advisor to the International Olympic Committee, as well as a transgender athlete herself, has done extensive research on the effect of hormone replacement therapy on athletic ability, specifically when it has to do with runners. Harper claims that some of the introduced disadvantages that trans women would experience after going on HRT are things such as decreased aerobic capacity as well as a decreased muscle mass. She says that these disadvantages as well as other disadvantages essentially make a trans woman perform like a big car with a small engine.
Hormone therapy that trans women undergo makes many changes in the biological qualities that are important for sport. Trans women have bigger frames which are now being powered by reduced muscle mass and reduced aerobic capacity, so it's like a big car with a small engine competing against a small car with a small engine.
Looking up some studies myself, I stumbled upon one where Tommy Lundberg states within his study that the effects of power and muscle mass is significantly less than others speculated to be between transitioning from male to female. However, this was done on less people, all of which weren't training at the time. The one thing that all studies have stated is that being on HRT has shown a decrease in muscle mass and endurance. However, there is no agreed upon range for what that would be. Another agreed upon idea between all studies is that because of the growing interest in the topic as of the last decade or so, that there isn't enough data to give more definitive conclusions on just how HRT can affect trans athletes, so more studies are necessary.
Yeah, everything's hypothetical in a sense because we don't have enough analytical data.
When it comes to the idea of fairness of including trans women in sports with cis women, that's where the sensitivity of the topic really is the strongest. And again, the idea of what is considered fair is very subjective.
Well, I think they're wrestling with how to handle it sensitively to all people involved.
I believe that every person has the right to be able to compete in sports of their choosing. However, a point that needs to stop being ignored due to confirmational bias, which means nitpicking points that favor your stance while disregarding points that wouldn't support your point, is that the problem is much bigger than one may realize, that it is much more than just skin deep. When one transitions, I can only imagine that, even though when they look in the mirror, they can envision who they are on the inside and want their physical looks to reflect that. And in doing so, it hopefully gives them a better sense of self and being true to who they are. However, the point that is not talked about enough, because it is usually seen as a taboo subject and a reason to cancel a person over, is that regardless of whatever you may transition to, there is no such person that can transition their chromosomes to become the opposite sex. And each sex has their own advantages and disadvantages, depending on what is taking place. And saying such things doesn't make someone a transphobe, bigot, or mean that you don't respect the individual that is a transgender. It's just speaking the truth that a lot of people would rather not say.
There's not a binary choice that if you are conflicted on this issue, you're against transgender. No.
As for the physical demands of most sports, yes, the idea of being a biological man gives more advantages to performance when competing against a biological woman. According to WebMD, when asked about the idea of men being able to build more muscle mass and strength faster than women, yes, guys have an easier time developing muscle mass and strength than women, especially transitioning after puberty. This is going to be very important to remember for the remainder of this video. It is being argued whether it is fair to include transgender athletes into the gender that they identify as. However, when it came to the idea of having women's sports, it wasn't on the idea of separating them based on their gender. It was that of their sex. specifically because women wanted to be able to compete in the same sports that men do, but not have to actually play against them to be included. Speaking of inclusion, when we look at other ideas of being inclusive, that doesn't necessarily mean to be included in what is already there. For example, to have a women's bathroom, changing room, and showers, all separate from the men's, is the idea of including them needing their own space instead of having co-ed facilities, but I'll talk more about that later. This leads into the idea of discussing whether or not transgender athletes should have their own category, or if they should compete against the gender they identify as. The idea is fairly split on both ends, and some would argue that for the most part, it honestly depends on who is being asked. Generally speaking, when asking cis men if men and women should compete together, the answer is more so laughed at or suggested as a good idea sarcastically, or should be done to end the idea of who's better between men and women.
Why don't you combine, just solve the problem? I'm sure the men would be all for this. The men and women play together, and then we don't have to guess.
Generally speaking, when asking cis women, they make it clear that men and women should be kept separate, as men and women's sides of the same sport are almost different sports as far as performance.
I love to play women's tennis, and I only want to play girls because I don't want to be embarrassed.
I feel as though making all sports gender neutral in that way, there is still some biological benefits to being born a man versus being born a female.
Would you want to have guys and girls competing against each other in that level, or does it matter?
I don't think you should be competing against each other. Just keep it separate.
And generally speaking, when transgender athletes have been asked, they have seemed to favor the idea of just playing against their gender identity, and maybe in time, the idea of competitions within one's own gender, or genders overall, would eventually be a thing of the past.
Trans inclusion is fairness. It is unfair to exclude legal and medical women, trans women, from women's sport.
Your body's a vessel. It shouldn't matter whether you're male or female, because I feel like the sport, like sports in general, is growing. So I feel like as sports growing, as we're evolving as a society and we're being very progressive, that it should get to the point, if we're talking about gender neutral bathrooms, why can't we talk about gender neutral sports?
However, according to Title IX, the idea of separating athletes by gender was not the goal. It was the separation of the sexes with the understanding of the advantages men would have over women. That the way you are on the outside wasn't the factor for what was considered equal, but what your biology is.
The whole point of Title IX, which created the federal requirement to have girls' sports and have schools recognize girls' athleticism and competition in sport, was to do this, to recognize and create sports programs for girls, because before that it was all for boys.
Kind of like for Zelda, when Link wears different color outfits, you may personally favor one over the other as far as the color, but each one has their own powers that gives the player advantages for specific things in the game. When looking at how transgender athletes have performed against their cisgenders, the news mostly just talks about trans women now breaking the records previously held by cis women. There's not really news talking about trans men dominating men's sports.
What we usually hear in the news and politics and stuff is about trans women, just because they're in so much prominence, because they are winning. I can't remember what her name is right now, but she was a powerlifter. She is a powerlifter. I think she went to Tokyo Olympics, and she's transgender. And they're winning by a large amount of weight.
I wanted to originally include Mac Beggs, as he went on to win twice as a trans man. However, he won competing against cis women while using testosterone. Granted, he wasn't allowed to compete against men at the time.
If you truly believe that trans women have an advantage, even with hormones, then that means you truly believe that trans men have a disadvantage, even with hormones. So the argument that you hear most of the time is against trans women. So does that mean that you're okay with trans men having that disadvantage?
Their argument is the same problem of the same side of the same coin. One gives an advantage to one gender, one gives a disadvantage to another gender. Both are equally unfair. This is the issue being talked about for what happened in Connecticut. 2 trans women were competing against cis women and winning, even potentially replacing the opportunity of some of their competitors for getting scholarships. This has caused a lot of controversy, as they were not taking any HRT at the time, giving them no level playing field as far as testosterone levels compared to their competitors.
And we begin today with the question of whether transgender high school girls should be allowed to race on high school girls' track teams. And in Connecticut, these parents have said it's not fair.
I think there's a myth of an even playing field. There are all kinds of reasons that people have advantages. Somebody's parents can give them year-round training. Somebody else is really, really tall and someone's really, really short. I mean, there's no such thing as a level playing field.
Lawsuits have been filed as it claimed they have broken rules by allowing them to compete, some even mentioning that they weren't doing well against cis men. and once competing against cis women, started winning. When looking at the numbers, they were winning against cis women. However, when the numbers are compared to cis men of the same competition, the numbers wouldn't have made it to the top 25, showing a gap difference in performance of cis women and cis men, with a transgender athlete apparently mentioning the unfairness when interviewed about it. As for the transgender athletes of the Connecticut incident, when interviewed, they mentioned that they were successful because they put in the work, and to focus on training rather than fairness when competing against men that identify as transgender. One of the issues a lot have seemed to question is the sincerity of the athletes that transition to be able to play in sports that allow them to win against cis women, compared to competing against cis men. As far-fetched as it may sound, when looking at how society is today, where, for example, a man was forced to pay child support simply because a woman named him on the birth certificate, never once seen or met the woman or the child, and even the DNA test proved that he wasn't the father. However, he had to pay her for 13 years before it was finally lifted. But because of the law, that DNA test could now be used to prove paternity. Anything prior wasn't reversed, so he got none of the money back he previously paid, and she faced no consequences for her actions. It is not too far out of line to question it, especially because for what most claim as the greatest stage of athletes, the Olympics, surgery isn't required anymore. Think about all the movies or episodes of shows that have been made regarding this overall issue. Joanna Man, Eric Cartman faking a handicap to be able to win Special Olympics gold, The Ringer, and it has actually happened in real life as well. A man who was caught posing as a nurse ended up competing against women and winning medals for it, claiming to be transgender, competing in various nations and winning 3 of their medals as a trans woman, and could face charges for entering women's sports. The Spanish basketball team in the Paralympics of 2000 had players who weren't disabled and eventually won gold. Only 2 players had their IQ within the required range. The rest of them had fake medical certificates. Kind of reminds me of one particular scene from Benchwarmers.
He's got documentation.
Even a British rapper broke the female weightlifting record while identifying as a woman, claiming that there is no proof that at the time he didn't identify as a woman, and anyone who questions them is a bigot and transphobic.
Male British rapper claims to have broken the women's weightlifting record while identifying as female. In his post, he outlined that he was identifying as a woman. We spoke to him.
The video went viral because it touched on a timely issue. According to their own logic, they have no proof that I myself did not identify as a woman whilst doing that video. So by their own logic, I could easily accuse them of being transphobic or being bigoted by claiming that I, in fact, was not a woman at the time that video was recorded.
However, me bringing these examples up is not me saying that this is indicative of how all of the LGBTQ+ community, especially trans athletes, are or think when it comes to sport. I already explained that I can understand as to why they may transition. However, there is always going to be some people that will sink low enough to try to find loopholes and to be able to cheat the system. Even trans athletes and trans people in general hate the idea because that one person does not represent everybody. It is simply just one incident, and unfortunately, the only things that make the news, for the most part, are things that are unexpected and or negative. And it only takes one person or incident to have everyone stereotyping everyone similar and treating them all as one person or incident that occurred. Do you remember what happened to everyone Middle Eastern after this? We will never forget. This is a good example of the idea of participation versus representation, which normally could be used for something like diversifying the workplace to fill positions based on skin color over skill, when the idea should have been more focused on equal opportunities, not equal outcome.
You're saying that anyone who believes in equality, whether you call them feminists, call them whatever you want to call them, should basically give up because it ain't gonna happen.
Only if they're aiming at equality of outcome.
So you're saying...
To wrap this up, when asked what the issue seems to be with transgender athletes competing, Rachel McKinnon, a transgender woman cyclist, stated,
"What, as you understand it, is their problem with you competing?"
I'm legally and medically female.
Which is true. She is legally and medically a female on paper. However, it cannot be ignored that when it comes to medical practice, doctors cannot simply just start treating you as the gender that you identify as. Take a transgender man, for example. If he was to become pregnant, would the doctor treat him like a man and do nothing as they cannot biologically get pregnant? Or a transgender woman who gets prostate cancer? To never try to treat it because biological women cannot get prostate cancer?
He's out of line, but he's right.
Science cannot be ignored, even for the idea of political correctness, because the harm it could cause to oneself or those surrounding them could be worse than acknowledging it. And yes, I do acknowledge that people still calling you what you biologically are can be disrespectful as you identify differently, but for safety reasons, it has to be addressed where appropriate. Take, for example, when a transgender woman MMA fighter broke in the face of her cis woman opponent. This incident had led many to question the safety of the cis women athletes competing against transgender women. As I've already stated many times in this video, that biological men in general are faster, stronger, and bigger than biological women.
If you truly believe that trans women have an advantage, even with hormones,
then that means you truly believe that trans men have a disadvantage, even with hormones. So the argument that you hear most of the time is against trans women. So does that mean that you're okay with trans men having that disadvantage?
I feel as though making all sports gender neutral in that way, there is still some biological benefits to being born a man versus being born a female. When you first think about like transgender athletes, I guess the first thing you think about is, well, biologically, transition usually happens after puberty, right? So if this biologically male athlete goes through puberty, he gets like better bone structure, he has all these skills that he enhances, all these muscle that he puts on, and then he transitions. Yes, your testosterone levels go down, but you're always just gonna have that like things that you've gone through like during puberty that you have after you've transitioned. So I feel like there's always gonna be that advantage.
I think it's dependent on the gender that they are transitioning to. For example, trans women do have somewhat of an advantage. Biological men are naturally born with higher bone density and larger lung capacity and a larger heart, and that's not something that can necessarily be changed with hormones. Of course, this isn't the same for trans men athletes.
For me, it's just on average, guys are typically a little bit stronger, a little bit larger, a little bit taller. So depending on the sport especially, it can give them a large advantage.
Men and women are obviously biologically different, and people who go through male puberty do have an undeniable advantage in sport. That is, unless they undergo hormonal transitions. Due to the fact that as somebody with testosterone running through your body, it's a lot easier to build a lot of muscle. While HRT does decrease muscle mass to an extent, a lot of powerlifters are not going to want to lose a lot of their muscle mass because it's, something that they work so hard for. The problem here is that people with testosterone can get up to 200 to 300 pounds of pure muscle, and for people without that level of testosterone, like cisgender women, it's a lot harder and even sometimes impossible for them to get that much muscle on their body. There is, however, the concern of whether or not it's fair that trans women were able to build up so much muscle before transitioning and keeping so much of that muscle mass that is, like I said, a lot harder for cisgender women to build. Even if a cisgender woman worked really, really hard, built up muscle, you still have to think about whether or not that is fair to that cisgender woman, because she obviously had to work a lot harder to get that much muscle on her body.
Men are stronger, men are faster, we all get that.
Men's tennis and women's tennis are completely almost two separate sports. It's a completely different sport. The men are a lot faster, and they serve harder, they hit harder. It's just a different game.
Rachel then goes on to state,
there is an undisputable advantage for men in sport, isn't there?
If we talk about men being faster than women, we have to be very careful what we're talking about. So the example you gave was at the
in most speed and strength sports, they have a 10%, 12% advantage in most scientific opinions.
At the elite level, the very best athletes in men and women, you see this roughly 10-12% gap. But if we're talking about like the average man, that's
when
not
we're
true.
talking about the IOC, we're talking about the elite level, aren't we?
Of course.
Do you think you'd have been a world champion cyclist if you hadn't transitioned?
I don't think I am a world champion because I'm a trans woman. I put in the work.
This is where I feel a lot of people have more of an issue of, is that the inclusion of transgender athletes is an all or nothing deal, that they can either be included in all or none of the sports all at once.
It has to be this, or it has to be that.
When so many have made the claims of the advantages of being biologically one gender over the other, and not enough studies have been done over prolonged periods of time to prove, generally speaking, any kind of definitive idea without bringing in speculation or science based on biology alone.
Yeah, everything's hypothetical in a sense because we don't have enough analytical data.
Trans inclusion is fairness. It is unfair to exclude legal and medical women, trans women, from women's sport.
Would you not have male or female categories?
I think that's a great question. I think that's a different question. So I think it's not fair to trans people to say, well, in order to fix whether to include you in sport, let's just radically shift how we do sport.
But to be fair, the idea of radically changing how they do sports is unfair in how they include you, whether it be gender neutral, male, female categories, yet now including trans athletes to be able to compete against their gender, especially on the women's side, is radically changing their side of sport, as transgender athletes are dominating a lot of their sports that cis women once did. That's not in your consideration for radically changing sports? The AFL supported this idea, actually banning Hannah Mounsey for being able to compete against cis women because, as one transgender advocate agrees, that she has an unfair advantage, being 6'3", and 220 pounds, making her dominant over all competition.
The range of body sizes and strength levels within a sport, you can be successful with massively different body compositions, even within my sport. So again, a British example would be Victoria Pendleton. Teeny tiny skinny legs, best in the world.
The exceptions don't define the rule. For example, Nate Robinson being 5'9" and winning a dunk contest, and Thiago Lemos being around 5'6". Couldn't find his height anywhere, but I've seen him next to other skaters whose heights are confirmed, and even making the tallest of ledges seem like curbs. This was done switch, by the way. However, when looking at their peers, they're generally taller and bigger, yet these two individuals perform like them or better at times. So again, the exceptions do not define the rule.
It should get to the point, if we're talking about gender-neutral bathrooms, why can't we talk about gender-neutral sports?
This is much bigger than sport in that it's the proxy for all of trans inclusion in society. Talk of bathrooms has shifted into sport by people who don't care about sport.
Number 5, bathrooms. Now, I'm certain many of you guys are asking yourselves, why would you talk about the bathrooms in the same idea as you would about sports? They're completely different issues. Actually, when you really think about it, they both have the same idea for why men and women are separated, safety reasons. And to add to that, to be able to give each sex privacy and comfort to do as they need to do. Because the idea of inclusion that women need bathrooms, changing rooms, and showers, for example, doesn't mean they need to be included in with the men. That they can be included equally by having their own place equal to the men's. That way it is fair for both sexes.
On average, guys are typically a little bit stronger, a little bit larger, a little bit taller.
Despite that my channel's audience is more men than women, for any women watching, or any guy who has sisters, nieces, a girlfriend, wife, you get the picture. You can relate to the idea that for a woman's safety, for them to have a place that they could feel safe, comfortable, and have the necessary privacy to do as they need to do is very important. Because if a man with malicious intent was to go into the wrong bathroom, odds are that he would be able to overpower a woman compared to her overpowering him. And you don't need to question the idea of what could happen. They made enough Law & Order and CSI episodes on the topic for you to be able to grasp on exactly what I'm referring to. Now again, I'm not saying that all men are like this, but as far as what you can see in the news, again, they generally cover things that aren't supposed to happen. It's the same idea to how the movie Jaws got people thinking sharks are man killers. And yes, sharks have killed people before, but the odds would drop to 0 if we didn't swim where the sharks live in and have home court advantage. This is why you may see fathers bringing in young daughters into the men's bathroom, where they can make sure they have the ability to do what they need to do for safety as men are allowed in the men's bathroom, and vice versa for mothers bringing in their young sons into the women's bathroom. And I completely support the idea, as we all know, child abductions are on the rise again, and as a parent, the idea of a young child going into the restroom where the parent can be present and allow their child to do as they need to do, meaning the child is safe, is better than them going into a bathroom unattended and hoping for the best. And the talk of having gender-neutral bathrooms where they have several stalls and urinals in it, rather than just one stall and one urinal, still questions a lot of safety issues that I've already brought up. Take, for example, a young girl having Mother Nature call her up for the first time. Even as guys watching this, I'm certain you'd understand the idea that she would be far better off with other women around her to be able to comfort her and talk her through everything that's going on, rather than to possibly have a man in the bathroom. She starts crying loudly for people to investigate, they come in to see a little girl, blood, and a guy using the urinal. But now let's go ahead and add transgenders wanting to use the gender they identify with into the equation. I understand and respect the idea that they identify with a particular gender and want to use that bathroom. However, this idea has become a topic of a lot of backlash for both sides of this when it came to an incident at We Spa in LA. The women present at the spa at the time said a person, or man, was in the women's section with his anatomy out on display. And even worse, there were very young girls who witnessed the incident.
It's okay, I just want to be clear with you. It's okay for a man to go into the women's section, show his around the other women, young little girls underage. Your spa, We Spa, condone that. Is that what you're saying? Like I asked. It's so he can stay there. He can stay there. What sexual orientation? I see it lets me know he's a man. He is a man. He is a man. He is not no female. He is not a female. He is not a female. Hold on. He is not a female, sweetie. Okay, girls down there, other women who are highly offended for what they just saw. And you did nothing. Absolutely nothing. In fact, you sided with him. So We Spa is an agreement with men that just say they are a woman and they can go down there with their and get into the women's section. Is that what you're saying? What really? What law? What law? So women can go into the men's with their okay. Yeah, you shouldn't. I wouldn't come back either. Yeah, get your money back. You got a man with his talking about he's a woman. He ain't no woman. Yeah, give her money back. There's no such thing as transgender. He has a, okay? He has hanging out. Okay, no, I'm not one. Actually, I'm a woman who knows how to stand up and speak up for my right. As a woman, I have a right to feel comfortable without a man exposing himself, okay? No, you go somewhere else. Okay, so that's right. No, he's not a transgender. He has, just like you do. Are you? No. Yeah. Okay, it's not okay. It's not okay. Okay, that's traumatizing to see that. I'm a woman. I think this is a place right here, I'm told, only for women. So how dare you sit up here and tell me I don't have a right as a woman to defend? I'm telling you, he has a. I'm up here at the Wii Spa, and a man, okay, comes in slinging his. I almost want to fall out. I couldn't believe what I saw. And you got some women scared to say something. Baby, I'm not scared to say a thing. The blood of Jesus against this wilding out lying spirit. No. You best believe I'm going to say something. But if he identifies as a man, I don't care. So men can just say, I'm a woman today and I want to come in. What about women's rights? No. Little girls, grown women. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you feel comfortable about it
Oh, so now we have to leave.
If you feel uncomfortable, because we cannot discriminate against gender.
But then why do you have men's section and women's section?
Gender identity, if they identify as female, they let us know.
So I'm a man and I can walk in there?
No, you identify yourself as male.
So I can tell you, so we can lie.
And there's a 9-year-old and a 14-year-old that's never seen a penis before.
That traumatized me to see that.
We are women.
Yes.
And that traumatizes us.
Yes.
No, but I'm saying we're older women. We're not little girls.
Right.
And we're here to protect the little girls because it's not okay.
It's not.
And now I can't even go and put my clothes on because he's down there.
Yeah. So like I said, I want every woman get all of their information. Okay. Well, I don't care what the security guard. He's just security. Yeah.
Sometimes predators go down and we'll just go to the woman's side.
Okay, well, no, he's sitting in there. Okay, well, security.
No. He doesn't want to.
Oh, okay.
He should have not been allowed to.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. We know that.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly.
This is my daughter. I blocked her face, obviously. She's got the little yellow Wii Spa shirt on, and she's got a little stuffed animal there. So she was 6 years old at the time. And this is both of us. And she's got a little Wii Spa shirt. So, 6 years old, and this is a Korean family spa, so there's children there all the time. This is the children's section at Wii Spa. They have like a whole little playroom, and so this is her in the little playroom. So that was in January of this year. And like I said, it's a Korean spa, so everyone's naked. And I wanted to be kind of culturally with it, so we also were nude in the women's side of the spa. And there's little girls who are naked with their older Korean grandmas who are naked. And the women's section has like hot tubs and like massage areas, and everyone's nude. And this is my first time, and like I said, I was kind of uncomfortable, but I was like, okay, well, this is how they do it, and we were trying to kind of have the experience. So we got into the hot tub, my little 6-year-old daughter and I, and we were having a great time. We were in there with other women when a person, I guess, with a beard came over with 2 girlfriends. They appeared to me to be lesbians with tattoos and colored hair, and they appeared, the 3 of them, to be kind of progressive activist types. They came in with kind of an entitled attitude, and they sat down on the edge of the hot tub where I was with my daughter, my 6-year-old daughter, who was naked. And the person with the sat down on the edge of the hot tub with just fully on display, with his genitals fully on display. And so me me and the other women in the hot tub kind of looked each other in the eye and just kind of made this face like, what the heck? And, you know, we're motioning to my daughter, I'm motioning to my daughter, and the women in the hot tub are like, I know, what the hell? And, you know, we were just uncomfortable, and I was trying to block my daughter from seeing on the person with the 5 o'clock shadow who was not trying to look like a woman at all. And we got out of the hot tub, and I walked away, and I thought I spoke to like a different woman, and this other woman said, you know, they spoke to this person about covering up, but they refused, and I felt kind of horrified. I have no problem with gay people, no problem with trans people. This is different. This is different. My daughter is 6 years old, and she was like nude, and this person wasn't making any attempt to look like a woman whatsoever. They walked in with the most entitled attitude, almost like spreading their legs on purpose, with these 2 other very progressive, activisty looking women into a Korean spot. It's really, really, really Korean too. They didn't care about making the old Korean ladies uncomfortable. They just walked in almost hoping someone would say something. So I was uncomfortable. I left with my daughter and went downstairs to talk to someone at the front desk, and they apologized. And I got these 2 free passes to the spa because I was upset. So that's what they gave me, and they said sorry. And then I spent the next day just really feeling horrible. It took me the whole day to even tell my husband what happened. I didn't want to say what happened. I couldn't really talk about it without crying. And I hate that the Antifa people are trying to pretend that everybody who has a problem is a homophobe or a transphobe. That's not true.
The We Spa defended its stance in the incident, saying that LA has a transgender population with some enjoying the spa and wants to be fair in meeting all customer needs and to not discriminate against anyone. The one was saying that there shouldn't be any male anatomy inside the women's section, regardless of the gender they identify with. The other was advocating for transgender rights, saying that because the individual in question identified as transgender, that they should be free to be in whatever area of their choosing, even with their anatomy out on display where young little girls could be present. Antifa showed up and started bullying the protesters and trying to force transphobes to leave.
Excuse me, are you being violent? Lady, it's
But as you heard the woman in the clip saying, she simply just doesn't want the male anatomy being on display where women are present, especially in areas where women could be most vulnerable like bathrooms or where women could be most exposed. Now let's look at 2 definitions, the first being transphobic, second being bigot.
It's not a binary choice that if you are conflicted on this issue, you're against transgender.
No. I completely agree with her statement, in that simply because you disagree with the choice of something doesn't necessarily mean you're phobic about it. You could not like the way that someone conducts themselves and still not hate them for it.
If at any point during that porno, somebody started like kissing somebody's feet or like sucking on their toes, it was just gross to me. But that doesn't mean I hate feet and I don't want them in my neighborhood. That just means I'm not into that. She's like, yeah, I think you're homophobic. It's like, no, what's on the same level? You ever see a big guy eating a sandwich, right? And he gets a little mustard on the side of his face, right? You look away. But that doesn't mean you want him to choke on the sandwich and you want to get a bunch of friends to beat out of him for eating the sandwich, right?
This is where it gets complicated. I'm sure if anybody disagreeing with this video has made it this far, will eventually dislike bomb this into YouTube hell.
I think it's going to be across the board, right? I think there's going to be people that agree with you and then that don't agree with you, right? So it's kind of, you can't win.
There's still like a very sticky situation. There's still like a very complex discussion to be had.
This issue won't be solved easily and without some feeling that their rights are being infringed upon. However, it shouldn't be the best idea to think that your rights should be upheld by downplaying the rights of others. In this case, the rights of the cis women are being downplayed upon to uphold the rights of the transgender woman in question, and especially the rights of the child, whom of which can't legally make decisions for themselves, whereas the transgender woman in question could, making it seem like the freedom to do as the transgender woman sees fit is far more important than understanding the effect seeing cis male anatomy had on those women who weren't expecting or wanting to see it freely on display, and especially to have a child who maybe wasn't aware of what they eventually saw, now having to figure out that way, and in a single-digit age, to learn why a woman they saw has something that cis women don't.
There's a 9-year-old and a 14-year-old that's never seen
seen it before. That traumatized me to see that. We're women. Yes. And that traumatized us. Yes. No, but I'm saying we're older women. We're not little girls. Right. And we're here to protect the little girls because it's not okay.
This is an incident where those advocating for this individual's rights should have put more thought into their stance, because the articles that first came out on the incident are now very different and why a lot of people are giving backlash towards the transgender community. Before we talk more about the individual within the incident, I have a question to ask you. Because this issue revolves around the idea that cis male anatomy was being shown, and the LGBTQ+ community and their allies have been fighting for their rights to be respected, and I do agree that they shouldn't be treated differently and to be given respect. But this is my question. If the cis male anatomy is out on display in an area where only women are supposed to be allowed, including very young little girls, does it matter what the top half looks like or identifies as? If you were to see this incident happening from a distance with no context, would you feel it to be okay because the top half is identifying as a woman or as a man? If a cis man was to go to jail and end up on lists for exposing himself, wouldn't it be fair to think that any other person with their cis male anatomy out face the same consequences? Or does identifying as something else give them immunity to punishment, or even a sense of entitlement? These types of questions have led to charges being brought up for the individual. Darren Marager was charged with 5 felony counts of indecent exposure. Marager stating that nobody ever saw them naked, as they were underwater up to their chest, that everything being said is a lie and is all harassment due to people being transphobic. And this isn't even the worst of it. Marager was also a registered offender since 2006, where they again exposed themselves to women and children in a changing area of a swimming pool in West Hollywood. So, to all the protesters, how do you feel now that you know this? Marager was a registered offender, and this isn't their first rodeo. This is why I hate blind activism before getting all the facts straight. And there's going to be some people that will argue the idea of, well, what is between their legs is absolutely nobody else's business. And I completely agree and support that statement, as long as you keep that business to yourself. And in this situation, they made what is supposed to be private, public, and exposing that to cis women and cis young little girls, making that entire argument void and making it to where we can actually have criticism towards their actions. Unfortunately, this is why it can get very complicated, because when it comes to encountering people, we cannot read their minds or know who they are past their appearance when first seeing them. And a few of the points I saw online being made were questioning if they were really a transgender woman, or was simply saying that they were to try to lessen the consequences for their actions, as they could then have the LGBTQ+ community backing their actions. This could be comparable to how someone knows they're screwed in court, and instead of actually taking full responsibility for their actions, they may try to plead insanity. Unfortunately, these types of thinking may end up working for people trying to cheat the system. Again, not saying insanity pleas are all like this. However, it inevitably ends up hurting those they are identifying as in the long run. It's the same issue for women who are actually graped with a silent G, having people question the sincerity of their experience because of particular individuals that falsely claimed that they were graped with a silent G because of regret or they had malicious intent. Even in the incident where a 16-year-old girl accused a man of assaulting her on a bus, she called her 17-year-old brother to tell him of the incident, to which he goes out and finds the man accused of the incident, gives him several head injuries and leaving him unconscious on the sidewalk. The man's life ends days later from his injuries, and after reviewing CCTV footage of the surrounding area, showed the man and the girl simply passing one another with no interaction between them. For the cost of her having to learn a lesson so severe at the expense of another's life and face no consequences because she is not 18 and didn't know what she was doing.
She don't know what she's doing. She don't know what she's doing.
Yeah, she does. She knows exactly what she's doing.
Even earlier, when the individual broke the women's weightlifting record while identifying as a woman, claiming that there isn't proof that they didn't identify as a woman in the moment. This dangerously opens Pandora's box, and unfortunately, it is much harder, if not impossible, to close it once it is opened.
So men could just say, I'm a woman today and I want to come in. What about women's rights? No. Little girls, why do you have men's section and women's section?
Gender identity, if they identify as female, they let us know.
So I'm a man and I can walk in there?
No, you identify yourself as male.
So I can tell you, so we can lie.
Because yes, as I've stated plenty of times already, the actions of the individual doesn't fully, or even partially, represent the ideals and practices of the party they identify as. However, all it takes is for one bad apple to spoil the bunch and create a very negative and possibly dangerous stereotype. Asians can't drive.
How much signal I need to cut across 8 lane? None? I turn now. Good luck, everybody else.
All black people love fried chicken, watermelon, Kool-Aid, cornbread. No, that should sound good as a mother.
White people are racist. Hispanics are trying to steal Americans' jobs. And all police are out to kill minorities, all of which are harmful and not representative to everyone involved. Again, the idea of representation versus participation. And if an individual decides to use these ideals to their advantage, it could lead to very drastic consequences. So what is the solution? Can there be a solution? Unfortunately, there's no easy solution to this. You can't fix this overnight. And as far as how I see this working out in the present, with the prior idea of inclusion not necessarily being put into what is already present, that's what makes any solution tricky for sports. But the idea of a possible separate bathroom means that they are equally respected and included to give them a place where any transgender individual can feel safe to do as they need to do, regardless of how they identify. And again, I mentioned this because of safety reasons, because
the danger of it is that you're possibly outing somebody. In America alone, there's several places that it's still extremely dangerous to be an open transgender person.
And yes, creating a separate bathroom means that they could potentially be exposed. However, the possibility of it being an all gender means that anyone, cis or trans, can enter, and that anyone going in should be aware of that. And safety comes more into play for transgender women the most, at least according to how many situations involving them are reported compared to transgender men. The stigma of cis men being involved with transgender women is that of embarrassment, shame, and unfortunately it could lead to physical altercations towards the transgender woman. If you know Jake Paul now as an annoying boxer, he used to be an even more annoying vlogger following in the shadows of his older brother Logan. And he had a group of people called Team 10 that invited women to their house, to then be met with transgender women and received a lot of backlash for it.
What do you mean she's not a girl? You literally just said she's not a girl. What do you mean she's not a girl, Blaine? What do you mean it's fine? Like, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. Then why'd you say she's literally not a girl and like look at her? Why did you do that? You were told what? Okay, good. So girls are here.
Eddie Murphy was caught in the tabloids for being caught with a known transgender prostitute, making a statement in defense of the incident that they were simply just giving them a ride home. So safety for all people should be put towards the top of the list of importance when talking about these issues. And again, there is no easy solution. And the idea of trying to make this an all or nothing,
it has to be this or it has to be that,
is what is making this harder for so many to accept. Because what may work in one scenario doesn't guarantee the same success in others. And that's going to be it for this video. Again, I know this is a very difficult subject to talk about, where the argument of science and political correctness is argued as much as equality and fairness. But again, I hope that this video will just help to drive a more healthy, mature, and respectful conversation about it going forward.
There's still like a very sticky situation. There's still like a very complex discussion to be had.
Thank you all for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Stay safe and take care.